As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it and will send it back here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? You have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. This is the word of the Lord.
Jennifer, thank you so very much indeed. Just a moment while I just juggle one or two little things. There we go. So it's been a journey through Mark's Gospel, and we've been looking at the way Mark depicts this sort of urgent good news of the astonishing Jesus spreading as he acts and speaks. But we jump a little bit now, because we're going to take Holy Week, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday from Mark's Gospel, but we're going to have to do some bits a little bit out of turn to make that happen. So we jump to the end to fit in with the church's calendar. I've got a question for you to ponder in your head. I don't want answers shouted out, really. But I wonder how you feel when you can't find the words for something because it's too good. I wonder if you, taste something really splendid and trying to find something to say, all that comes out is a yeah, or in my case, I pull a dreadful face, because when I'm really happy, I tend to just pull the most appalling, scowly faces, and everybody thinks I'm sad, but I'm not. It's just I don't know what to do. Back in the early 70s, I went to my first ever gig at Birmingham Town Hall to see a band called 10 Years After. And I think I'd been told that rock concerts were loud, but I don't think I knew quite how loud they were. And the band came on, and the first song that they did was the first song off a new album, where Alvin Lee, the vocalist, sings "One of These Days, Boy," and then he hits a crash chord. And I think at that point, I realized what it would be like if somebody hit an anvil with a scaffolding pole. And bits of the town hall that had been clinging to the wall for quite a long time drifted slowly off, and the plaster wafted down to the floor. And I thought, oh, that was quite loud, that was. A moment where the only word that I could conjure up was a word that the preacher almost never uses in church, so I won't. But those moments that words can't express, the first gulp of a cold drink on a dry throat, an evening with friends when the conversation is so smart you fail to notice it was bedtime 2 hours ago, the picture of a hot air balloon going across the sky on a balmy summer's evening. For me, a sleeping chocolate Labrador puppy. And that's before we get to the 18 certificate stuff. Whatever it is for you, those just wonderful moments where it's great, but you couldn't think of a word to say. And I think we get one of those moments on Palm Sunday as it's described in the Gospels. How did people react when Jesus came riding into town? Some people had questions. What are you doing untying that colt? And they're really good questions, but they're dealt with by authority, not answers. It says Jesus had told the disciples to say, the Lord needs it and will send it back shortly. And that's what they said, and that was okay. The people let them go with the colt. Some people, oh, by the way, Matthew adds at that point, who is this? Matthew adds the question, who is this person? Some people served. Some people sacrificed their coats on the road of symbolism and threw them over the colt as Jesus came along. Some people saw the symbolism because they knew Psalm 118, bits of which we read slowly just now. And that's a psalm for a worship occasion. So it's a liturgical psalm. It's a psalm for a special occasion. So it's a processional psalm. It's a psalm for an enthronement occasion. It's a royal psalm. And it's a psalm for a seasonal occasion. It's an autumnal psalm. And before that time, the psalm was associated with David's great kingship. Someone like David is riding on a donkey into town. And that's interesting for those who would have studied the scriptures and known them. Some of the links to David are less well-known ones in the psalm. We tend to think only of a warrior and musician. It looks as if the people might be prepared to cope with anything the king might do. And we know David got up to some bad stuff, as long as they perceive he is a leader in touch with God. Because the psalm also tells us at the beginning about suffering, about rejection, about persecution, about overwhelming enemies, about humiliation, and about miraculous rescue. So this picture of a messianic king is set by David. And so if people are identifying Jesus with him, they should know what to expect. This journey into town will lead to suffering, rejection, persecution, overwhelming enemies, humiliation, and miraculous rescue. Yet they would also perceive this is a man in touch with God and worth following, as many disciples have up to the point of his entry into Jerusalem. Others may have recalled another verse from the Old Testament. This is Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. But some, as I've mentioned from the beginning, found it beyond words, and they just shouted or waved the nearest stuff they could find to wave, palm branches. Hosanna means save, and it's an exclamation of praise. Luke, in his gospel, tells us Jesus, in response to some of the party poopers, the Pharisees, suggested that if he shut his disciples up, the stones would sing. So on Palm Sunday, we retell the story of a man on a donkey. And as we do, we know that Jesus rides into everybody's life again and again, and it's our annual reminder. Jesus rides into your life. And some people have questions, and some people see the Old Testament prophecy and think, here's the one the prophets spoke of. Some people just sing. Some people get carried along and wave stuff. Some people find it deep and beyond words. And I guess, although they're not particularly mentioned, some people were profoundly practical and said, that'll need clearing up later, and got a shovel. Because processions need clearing up afterwards. And we know also that the being carried along stuff is really fickle. You can sing a great song today and shout crucify next week. A faith that produces only an emotional response, it must produce an emotional response, but if it produces only an emotional response, it has no likelihood of lasting when your emotions turn on you, as they surely will. We had in our passage that awkward bit about Jesus cursing a fig tree, and I'm not going to go into great detail about that this time because I think it attaches better to the passage when we come at it again later, because Jesus refers to it again later. We'll get to it then. But the fig tree parable bookends the clearing of the temple, which follows the procession. And so it may be an enacted parable. A cause of disappointment for Jesus is something not doing what it's meant to do. In his deeper eternal world, there are always figs. Fig trees don't have seasons where he comes from. If you want a fig, you get a fig. But we do note that Jesus, according to Mark, goes straight into the temple and ends up doing some minor acts of violence and protest. And what can we learn from this? Well, mainly this. And it's not obvious. Trading wasn't wrong. If ever you've been to a big event, there are always merchants outside. If you've ever been to a big place, there are always buskers and merchants outside selling you souvenirs. Get your souvenir programs here, get your scarf, get your whatever. And of course, the food concessions will be there as well. So on the way to a place where you needed to sacrifice a small animal, there'd be people selling small animals. If you wanted to show your faith with some sort of souvenir or badge, there'd be people there. If you've got large denomination coins and you wanted smaller ones, or you've got notes from a different currency and you wanted to change them, the money changers were there. And none of that is wrong. What was wrong was the place where it was happening. And it's not wrong that it was in the temple. It's wrong that it was in the place called the court of the Gentiles. You and I, not being of Hebrew or Jewish heritage, couldn't go right in. But there was a place set aside specially for us to participate. We were allowed to be part of what was going on in the temple, and there was a court reserved specially for us. That court was not a gesture of a barrier, it was a gesture of hospitality. This is a special thing for us and our people, but you can come, you can be here, and there's a place from where you can watch. The merchants in the court of the Gentiles was making God more exclusive. They were stopping people from getting in and standing in the place they were allowed to stand. Now, I think the lesson of Palm Sunday is for us to take all those things I've said and balance them And that needs quite a complex balance. It's not just one thing against another. It's about four things to balance at the same time. We need to see the symbolism. We need to see the fulfillment of a prophecy. We need to see the need to respond to Jesus in worship. We need to see the need to respond to Jesus emotionally. We need to see the need for a practical response of service. And we need to see the violent internal reaction Jesus feels in the place he calls his Father's house. I was thinking, in the light of this week and a year on from us being locked down and doing this stuff at home, that this year has taught us one really big balancing act that we need to get right. Because it's easy to shout Hosanna in a big event and be carried along by the crowd, but crowds can turn and we get carried along. Peaceful protests we've seen this week can turn ugly easily. In one of our creeds, which we occasionally use, when asked if this is our faith, we respond with this: this is our faith, this is the faith of the church. This is my faith, and it's our faith. And we've been given a year without Hosanna moments. It's still the faith of the church that Jesus rides in. But we've had a year to think about, is it your individual faith? And I hope that you've been thinking about that and pondering. Because if we get all those blocks in place, the chances are that next week you'll see the events of Good Friday and Easter Sunday in perspective too, corporate events and personal events. And of course, as happened to them then, you might still from time to time be goaded by a crowd into doing or saying something you don't want to say or do, because crowds get you like that. You might, as we will find out in the story as it continues, run away. Some did, and some still do. As a preacher, I don't, because it's bad if you do, I don't find myself as speechless at these events as perhaps I should. And sometime in Holy Week, I try and grab myself an hour and I just sit in the study quietly and try to get it again. Just try and remind myself of these events, because the great crashing chord of that first song by 10 Years After became familiar after a while, and I knew what it sounded like. And the stories of the Christian faith over Lent and Holy Week and Easter become so familiar, we know them without noticing them. So I'm going to encourage you to look at a couple of questions in groups for about 5 minutes about the nature of corporate and individual faith. And I won't ask you to feedback, just give you a chance to chat with 2 or 3 other people. And then when we come back, we'll have our intercessions. Thank you so much for listening. Let me just stop recording.